Okay, so let's do a review to try and catch back up to where we were, and I've got a lot of examples for us to go through this time. So hopefully when we leave, whatever we manage to cover will be a little bit clearer. So the overview, we talk about induction versus deduction. What is observation? The principles of observation. Inductive, characterized by making inference of general laws from a specific circumstance, and deductive being the opposite. Do you remember the example of inductive versus deductive? We're all pretty clear on. We did this example with the numbers where, given a general rule, you derive a specific situation, and this one where, given a situation, you derive a general principle. So why do we do observation? Is because you can't make a valid interpretation. You can't inductively reason about what is being said and derive that general principle if you don't understand the circumstances. So deriving is called interpretation, whereas investigating and searching situation is the observation. So observation is just critical reading. It requires willingness to learn, patience, diligence, and some caution, because you don't want to get caught up in details, basically is what the caution is. So here are some questions you can ask, which are basically derived from who, what, where, why, when, and how. And if we're all good with that, we can go ahead and pull up a couple of examples, and we'll do some observation together. So if we'll start in, if you have your Bibles, Mark 2, verses 35 to 41. What verse? 35 to 41.
Mark 2?
Mark 2.
There's no Mark 2, 35.
Just go ahead and find it real quick. I bet it was probably like 12.
So it's he's working on Mark 4 maybe?
Or is the story of Jesus calming the sea?
Oh, that's 3, 35. I think is where it was. Was the end of 3?
Nope, that's not it.
Sorry, end of 4. 4:35. I saw flipping through there. I can remember what the chapter was.
Alright, so I just got a typo in my notes. Yeah, 4. If your Bible probably has it labeled as Jesus calms the storm, and there's just a paragraph on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to read that paragraph. We're going to do some observation on it. So I'll go ahead and read. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in a boat, just as he was. And the other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and waves were breaking into the boat, so the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?" So let's go through those 6 questions. Who, what, where, when, why, and how, and we'll answer them together as a group. And you might want to have your pen and paper out so you can write something on your scratch paper. So of course, the first question is, I'll let you finish.
And we're going to write
No, writing your scratch paper. We'll write conclusions in here, but we're going to write observations and stuff.
Can I just write it on the back of your handout? So
And this actually isn't something I use those archivic pens for. Archivic pens are for writing here. But if that's what you've got. Alright, everybody ready? Got something to write on and write with? Alright, so the first question is who? So let's start with who is the narrator in this story? Mark. That's an easy one because they're actually in the book of Mark. So Mark is the narrator. But how about this one in verse 35? On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross to the other side." Who is speaking in that case? It's Jesus. It's Mark quoting Jesus. So in verse 35, we have Jesus speaking, and we have Mark narrating. You can kind of keep going and see that. We'll move on from there. Who is being spoken about? So, who is this passage about? And? Jesus and the disciples. Jesus and the disciples, right? Because Jesus was in the boat with the disciples. The disciples were the ones freaked out by the storm. They're the ones that woke Jesus. Jesus talked to them afterward about, or they were the ones who came to, because Jesus spoke to them and said, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And it was the disciples who said, "Who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him?" So this is a story about Jesus and the disciples. But who else is there? Well, we have a crowd that was with Jesus, right? It says right in the beginning. And leaving the crowd, they took them in a boat, just as he was. They took him with them in a boat, just as he was. Right, so there's still another party that's there. Why not go ahead and read it again? Just the first 2 verses. The other boats. There were other boats there. So some of the crowd, or maybe all the crowd, managed to get on boats and were following Jesus across. So they actually were in the storm, and they saw Jesus calm the storm. So they were all onlookers in this whole event. And that's really it. Those are all the people in this, right? There's no one else in there. So what do we have for observation so far? And that there was a crowd that there were onlookers. There was a crowd involved in this. Alright, so next one is what. So what happened? And in this case, we could just read it again. You could say that's what happened. Put it in your own words. What happened? They didn't go fishing. They were crossing to the other side. And what happened when they tried to cross to the other side?
The water started going.
Right, because windstorm. Right? Then what happened? Right? Woke him up. Yep. Made the storm stop, and then teaching moment, right?
He just rolled his eyes and calmed the storm.
They were so afraid.
Right. And the last thing that happens is, like I said, it's a teaching moment where he tells the disciples, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" Right?
It's scary.
And there's a little summary in there about what the disciples learned from this. So that's what happened. So next is what ideas were expressed. What ideas were expressed? faith that was definitely expressed, or in this case, more the lack of, or need for fear. How about Jesus' humanity? He was sleeping, right? He was tired. And we also see Jesus' divinity. Calm the storm.
Even sleeping in a boat in a storm.
He gotta be one tired young man.
Tired. I've seen people sleep in the boat. And he was Galilean, so he grew up on the sea. Right? What other ideas? Anything?
I like the fear.
So we could write down his observations of Jesus' humanity, that he was tired, his divinity, that he stopped to see the fear and lack of faith of the disciples. He had a cushion. I'm not sure what that we're supposed to get from that.
Okay, thought enough of it. Thank you.
So here's another what question. What was the result of this whole story? What was the result?
Hopefully they learned something.
Yeah, just read the last verse.
Yeah.
Verse 41. What does it say?
Who then is this that you believe in?
Right. So here's an interesting thing: is looking at so we see that it doesn't mention their fear when it comes to the boat filling up. We can assume that they were afraid because they woke him up and said, "Hey, we're perishing." So obviously there was some bit of fear there.
But
It's interesting.
why are you so afraid?
Right.
Verse 4.
Right. But notice what happens in verse 41. What is the first thing it says?
And they were filled with great fear.
So afraid as they were of the storm, they still had room left to fear God for stopping the storm. So we can assume that their fear of the Lord was greater at that point than their fear of the storm. Okay, so where did this happen? Water. Sea of Galilee. Yeah, that's a good one. So I'll introduce you to another resource that you can use. Bible Atlas. So Bible Atlas will let you look up maps and study features of those different passages. And it's even got a scripture index in the back, so you can use start in a verse and work your way back into the maps. Or you can use the index and say, this is probably part of the life of Christ, that's page 199. See if I can find a map of the Sea of Galilee. So here's a map. You can see the Sea of Galilee up in the top corner. And what this map is showing is essentially Jesus' ministry, the journey he made on his ministry. So that gives you some idea of kind of where he was based on where he grew up and where major cities were. And that's just one of the maps. You can flip through there and probably find this map just of the Sea of Galilee. And of course, there's all kind of descriptive information to tell you about it. So if we had, a full day to work on this, we would probably take our time and actually read these different things on the Sea of Galilee, what was in an area. And if you were doing a thorough Bible study, which right now all we're doing is observation, this would definitely add to your study, give you some context for what's happening. So this Bible Atlas is a very valuable thing. Since you've already got the concordance, the next thing you would want, if you're wanting to buy more material, remember I said the concordance is the only thing you need, which you want to add to it. Second thing I'd add is a Bible handbook, and then finally the Bible Atlas would be third. This has already got the Bible dictionary baked into it, or else I'd say Bible dictionary. Since your concordance has it, there's not really a need for a separate book.
They say that people that actually go to Israel and see the areas that Jesus' ministry was in, they say it just completely changes the way they see his life. That when they read the scripture and stuff in their mind, they can see where he's been, what he did.
I bet.
I've had friends that have gone on the Life of Jesus tour or something that actually trace Jesus' steps in his ministry. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Anyway. So let's try another set of questions. How about when? So when did this take place? And that can be interpreted in many different ways. Let's start with what year did this take place? Without what? 80, 31? Yeah, somewhere around there. 80, 30 through 33, somewhere in there. So another question you could ask is what season was it? In this case, it doesn't really say. You might be able to find out using another source, but it doesn't say explicitly right here in the Bible what season it was. And maybe if you read some of the previous passages, you could derive it, but just from this passage we're studying right now, not looking anywhere else, it's hard to say what season it was. We can get a pretty good guess on the time of day, because it says right there in the first verse. Mm-hmm. What does it say?
On that day will be
evening. So it's evening. Right, so we know that this was somewhere around 30 AD in the evening. If you want to use other sources, we could look and find out what other events were taking place. But they don't seem to be real relevant to this. There isn't a talk about some war that's happening somewhere or anything. So we don't really have to worry about that too much. So here's another question then, we'll move on, is why. So why did this happen?
To show the disciples and the folks that Jesus was God.
Yeah. So this question is a little bit difficult to answer in something like this, because you're not seeing a lot of conscious choice, at least not apparent conscious choice. It's very possible that Jesus was like, oh, it's time for that storm I'm supposed to calm. Let's go get in the boats. We're already running late. But we don't see that explicitly stated here, so we can't assume that. Now, when you're talking about other situations, like if you're talking about, someone went somewhere with some reason to do something, or let's actually do this, Potiphar's wife. Why did she make the accusation against David that she did? Joseph. Yeah. Why did she make the accusation against Joseph that she did? Because she was a woman scorned. That's a why. In this case, we don't have a real good why, other than divine orchestration. But we'll get into some other passages where we have more whys. So how, finally, the last question, how were these things accomplished? Thoughts? How these things were accomplished? The answer is actually really obvious, so if you're thinking this is too obvious to actually be the answer, it's not. It's probably right. Divine power. It's God. How did God do this stuff? I don't know. Ask God. And how effectively was it accomplished? Flawlessly. Very good. So there, we've done answered those 6 basic questions on that specific passage. Everybody's feeling a little bit more comfortable with how this works.
Yeah, that's one of the handouts that I have to have next week.
Oh yeah.
Eventually you'll get to it, I hope.
Oh yeah, definitely. The reason I wrote this, wrote these out the way I did was so you could keep it next to you. As we build on this, I'll do some similar things for interpretation and correlation. So when we're practicing these things, you have those notes right next to you. Let's go ahead and try another one. So let's go to, or is there anything else that anyone wants to observe about this passage?
I love how he was human and tired and asleep from a horrible condition. Just tired.
Let me ask you something. Do you feel that you understand the circumstances of this better than you did when you started? Because I'm sure you all knew this story. Is it a little bit clearer in your head now? You've got a real concrete idea of exactly what happened, when it happened, how it happened,
Yeah.
who was involved. You can actually visualize being on the sea, watching Jesus stand in a boat, calming the waves, maybe from the perspective of one of the other boats following. The idea of this is that you really understand what is happening. Not necessarily what it all means, but you understand what is happening. In this case, this is a good example for observation. It would not be a good example for interpretation because the interpretation is right there in verse 41. Right? I mean, that kind of tells you what you're supposed to get out of this. You get the same thing the disciples did. According to
Yeah.
They had great fear and wondered who he was. But we'll go ahead and move on. Let's do Genesis chapter 32, verse 22.
32:22.
Yes, ma'am. All right, anybody not got it yet?
What was the verses again? Chapter verses 32 what?
22. Page
Jacob.
39 of these Bibles.
Jacob wrestles with God.
Oh, verse 22.
I read it the same night. I said, they just crossed the boat.
So, would someone else like to read this one for us? Just that paragraph. So 22 through 32.
The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children across the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of his joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of his thigh.
Interesting story, right? Notice that this one's a little harder than the last one. The next one is even harder. And we have one more after that that's even harder. And it's kind of the point for getting into a little bit more difficult to understand narrative here. Right? There's some really interesting things happening. So I guess first we'll ask, who is the narrator? Moses. We know that because Moses wrote the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers.
We learned that in our
Yep. Another resource you can go to, because all these things aren't going to be easy, is Bible Handbook. And if I were to recommend one more resource to get after the concordance, it would be a good Bible Handbook. What you can do is you can open these up, and there will be a section there on Genesis. And it'll actually have sections dedicated to sections of the Bible, so it'll describe what the Pentateuch is, what the books of the prophets are. And it will tell you about the book. It'll give you an outline, tell you a little bit about what's happening, the context, the historical context that was happening in, and it will tell you who wrote it and when it was written. So that's the two important things. It'll tell you who wrote it, when it was written. So let's see if I can find it really quick. Let's see.
Written during the 40 years.
So Moses' life was expected to be somewhere around 1526 to 1406 BC. So it was written sometime in that period. Here, you can take a look at this book. See that there's a lot of information. That Bible survey class that we spent 2 years on, that book is that class in a nutshell. It's more thorough than anything I could have covered. It has a lot more information, and you can keep it on your shelf and just access it anytime you need. You don't have to try and remember what I said all the time ago. So a very, very useful resource to keep around. Just to summarize, if you're going to get 2 more things, first one will be a Bible handbook, the second will be a Bible atlas. No, actually, the second would be a Bible dictionary, but like I said, your concordance already has it, so we don't need to worry about that. Alright, so we answered the who. So, and that's who's speaking. Now, we do see a couple other people speaking in this passage. So who else is speaking in this passage?
Jacob.
Jacob speaking, and God is speaking. I don't think there's anybody else. So who is being spoken about? It's easy, they're talking about each other. Right, so just dialogue between the two. Who else is watching? No one. It says right there that he was left alone. So there is no one. We can be sure that there's no one. It says that absolutely he was left alone. And who else is involved? There's not really anybody else involved. So what happened? Again, put it in your own words. What happened?
I'm envisioning like boys wrestling and red-faced and messy hair and tumbling on the ground and
landing on a bunny.
and I mean just like were they wrestling or fighting? Seriously, just wrestling?
Well, if that's the question, you're curious about what wrestling it means by wrestling. Let's call that a key word. So what do we do with that word? Do you have your concordance with you?
I know.
I'm wondering if it's wrestling or just roughhouse.
Well, it talked about them wrestling from from evening until morning.
That
And
was
that
one of those tricky ones where it's in Greek or
this case would be ancient Hebrew.
Hebrew.
What we wanted to do is start with the index. Or what you can do is you can do it alphabetically if you want.
Wrestling.
Yeah, so it's wrestling.
Yeah, if you look up wrestling, then you look for the verse.
Assuming that it's the same as it is in King James. That's the trick. But I'm guessing it's probably the same. While you're doing that, go ahead and look it up in King James just to be sure.
Oh, that is beautiful. Yeah. I'm looking through this and he goes a whole page on woman. Wrestle.
32, 24.
79.
That's the strong number. Yeah. So you're going looking for Strong's number 79 or 679. Yeah. Okay, it's strong number 79. Yes. It's going to be here where you have Hebrew. There's the Hebrew strong numbers and there's the Greek strong numbers.
Okay.
So you go over the Hebrew and you look for strong number 79. There's a strong number there. It's 2, 4, 9. So it's
Your eyes crossed like that. Yes. 9.
Okay. Grapple to wrestle. So unfortunately,
Any more of a definition than just grapple?
Grapple to wrestle.
yeah. So
Grapple and wrestle are the only two.
you know what I'm thinking? Grapple. I'm not thinking fist fight. I'm thinking like wrestling match where they're holding each other and trying to get the other one to lock and that kind of thing. So
Like horse fights.
they're probably rolling around on the ground, getting all dirty. And
Like
okay, so what happened? What ideas were expressed?
Jacob was relentless.
yeah.
Jacob was relentless.
Yeah, he was gonna stop and try to bless.
God is merciful.
Yeah, that was another thing. It said that he saw God face to face and didn't die. We remember Moses on Mount Sinai. He asked to see God. God said, "I can only let you see my back because if you see my face, you will die." So Jacob actually saw God face to face.
While wrestling.
Wrestling. Anything else? You want to just read over it again real quick?
Then he had 11 children.
Only?
12 tribes.
Oh.
That's what you think.
For Benjamin?
Oh yeah, he split Manasseh. Split Joseph's children. 12.
Yeah, this is Jacob just had one kid, right? And so never mind. Read it. Yeah.
So did Jacob know who he was wrestling?
Seems so because when he Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered."
And that's why he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me.
We see God kind of confirming this. Let's see. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. You have striven with God and with men have prevailed. And Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why do you ask my name?" So apparently God knew that Jacob already knew who it was. Alright, so go ahead, moving on from there. So where did this happen? There's mention of the ford of Jabbok. So we could probably look that up in the Bible Atlas and find that there as well and learn a little bit about the area. Like how wide was this stream? How hard would it have been to send 2 wives, 2 female servants, and 11 children, and all of your possessions across it? Would it take all day? And that's why he was there alone. It got dark and he didn't want to try to cross in the evening. It's a possibility. But in the interest of time, we're not going to look it up. So when did it happen? It's actually really hard to say.
Well, it said that they wrestled God from the evening to morning.
The same night he met his brother.
But does it say that in the passage?
No, but it says the same night, so you gotta go back and wonder what the same night was.
Oh.
And that's when he met Esau. Come back. When Esau, my brother, meets you and asks.
A couple 2 days, man.
So we know it was evening. What year it took place? That was actually a harder question. You would maybe the Bible handbook can tell you, because this covers. Remember, Genesis covers from the beginning of time to Israel and Egypt. That's a lot of time to cover. So knowing exactly when it happened is difficult. You'd have to look at the genealogies. You could figure it out. That'd be a lot of work. You could do it. Bible handbook might be a better option, see if they say anything. And if they don't, we can just conclude that it was a long, long, long time ago. According to many young Earth creationists, the Earth is not older than about 6,000 years old. So we can assume this is somewhere, 5, 6,000 years ago. Long time. So let's see. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? Next question, why? Yeah, you can look at it from Jacob's perspective and say, why did he spend the entire night wrestling with God? Why wrestle with God at all? Another question.
God, he had some purpose for it.
Another question is, why did God go out there and wrestle with Jacob?
You run into God while you're across the street. You have one chance.
What are you going to do? You're going to wrestle.
You wanted bless, I think.
It was what Jacob wanted, but another question is, why did God wrestle with Jacob? So there's a question, why did Jacob wrestle God? The Bible says it right there. He wanted to be blessed. Why did God wrestle with Jacob? What was God's purpose for wrestling Jacob?
To see how strong he was.
He put the man's hip out of socket by touching it. I think he was probably not having a strength problem there. Well, what came out of this instance with Jacob? I mean, what happened? Right? He changed his name to Israel, the name of the nation that were his chosen people. This was essentially God choosing the father of his people. He decided to do it with a wrestling match. So why did God wrestle Jacob? Probably because he wanted to bless him. To make him Israel, to bring about the Israelite nation. We can only speculate, but
Yeah.
but it's pretty good speculation when you figure that God was out there for some reason, and what came out of it was this is Israel, the nation of Israel. Moving on. So how were these things accomplished? That's pretty straightforward. How effectively were they accomplished? Again, there's God in here, so he knew exactly what was going to happen. He's got it protected. We've got about 5 minutes, and let's save the next two for next week. So we'll cover next week is James 3, which talks about controlling the tongue, and Psalms 1, which is a song regarding we'll see when we get there, but it's a little bit difficult to observe because it is a song, and it uses a lot of poetic language and that kind of thing, so it'll be a good practice. But for this week, let's continue doing our Acts Bible study, our quiet time, sorry. Let's continue memorizing our verses. And if you can, when you're doing your Acts quiet time, write down some observations. Even if you only do it 2 or 3 times this week, just take a couple of days. Say, today I'm going to not just read the passage, but I'm going to choose a block of it and I'm going to make observations on it. Kind of like we did today. Just answer those 6 questions. If you're willing to do the rest of the handout where you talk about the form of the passage and keywords and that kind of thing, you can. Or you can wait until we cover those in detail next week. Yeah, we can just do some observations. Practice makes perfect. And observation is one of those things you gotta practice. I hope this did give you a jump start though, so when you start observing it, it's a lot easier.
Do you want us to tell me first
You're quiet. No, you can keep them. You can do whatever you want with them. They're yours. Like I said, I'm never going to ask you to show them to me. I just want you to tell me something that you want to share out of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do that. And
to see how you can throw for a year.
yeah, exactly. That's one thing they're really good for. All right. If there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and close. Anything else? No? Okay. Then thanks for coming, and I'll see you all next week.